Welcome to the Only Human podcast, a platform for understanding what makes us human during a pandemic, through a transition, and after a crisis. Ritual and religion have long been trigger points of fascination in the discipline of anthropology. Rituals allow for a transformatory moment in time, a rite of passage through which one must go through in order to continue on a spiritual or religious journey in their lives. When a pandemic like COVID-19 is introduced into our everyday lives, certain spiritual or religious rituals are no longer possible. The question at hand is, how will religious bodies account for these changes in ritual and the impact of this in moments of liminality?
In this episode, we hear from Michael Shepherd about rethinking ritual and its place in religion during times of change. Michael is a professor at Hope International University in Fullerton, California, in the USA. While he teaches a variety of courses, his focus leans towards social sciences and religion. Outside of academia, he engages with applied anthropology through dynamics of change.
So at this time, I'm watching how organizations adapt to change, especially in regards to how people experience a deep sense of purpose and spirituality. And if we know where to look, there's a major disruption occurring in a set of initiation and belonging rituals that have existed for 2,000 years and connects over 2.3 billion people around the world. So this isn't just a small change that's happening in individuals' personal lives, but a major change for a major religion. So I'd like to set up the next few minutes by describing the background to some Christian ritual and liminality, and then talk about how I see faith communities adapting to virtual space because of the health crisis and stay-at-home orders. I came to this subject a bit sideways. I was teaching cultural anthropology a few years ago, and we were getting into virtual culture and all of its permutations, leaning a lot on research from Tom Belsdorf, who's at the University of California, Irvine. And the case study that I put together for my students was about the Church of Scotland, who at the time was considering the possibility of virtual communion and baptism in the spring of 2016. This was a big deal for the Church of Scotland because, like the Anglican Church, they have a very traditional institution. So it picked up some media attention. And it hit a nerve, tapping into issues of declining numbers and rural-urban divides, and opened up a conversation about what is the nature of those rituals and whether they can be adapted. And the leadership of the Church of Scotland eventually had to backtrack a bit to set the record straight. And the question of virtual ritual sort of went back to being a niche topic, same liminality. So liminality is this in-between space between two distinct realities. And we have this concept that we can see applied in many types of rituals, many types of group behavior, particularly initiations and rites of passage. The term ritual, however, Christians will generally use a term like sacrament or rite. Different traditions will have their own understanding of which rituals are sacraments and how theologically and practically they're conducted. There can be many sacraments, but the two that I want to focus on today, the two rituals I want to focus on, and we'll describe them in a minute, are communion, also called Eucharist, and baptism. For many churches, these are considered the two major sacraments, the two major rituals. And in all the diversity of world Christianity, there'll be other rituals that are practiced, but these two are primary. Even churches that would consider themselves non-traditional will have these sacraments, though their titles might vary. In the Roman Catholic tradition, for example, the term catechism is pretty well known. It's the instruction for people to understand the essential beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church. In an evangelical church, especially a large American church, you will not have catechism, but you will have membership classes. It is a program of instruction for people so they understand the essential beliefs and practices of that particular church. An evangelical leader would probably bristle at calling that class catechism, but they are functionally identical. And I bring this up just to highlight that every religious community has ritual. Even religious communities have ritual. Even non-religious communities have ritual. And also in Christian theology, there's a heavy emphasis placed on the concept of embodiment, which informs these rituals. One of the first major theological battles had to do with the essence of Jesus' composition. Was he spiritual with a physical form, like an avatar? Or was he physical with spiritual enlightenment, like a guru? The debate was supposedly settled by declaring that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine spirit, that both of these things exist, and the same dynamic exists when considering ritual. considering that the physical and spiritual inhabit the shared space. And so these two things together, fully physical and fully spiritual, reinforce this inertia for communities to maintain physical ritual together and not develop individual or abstract rituals. So what have churches done? Some churches have just gone dark. They've settled in for the time being and made a decision that they will reopen and get back to normal once all of the health crisis is over. For some of these groups, mostly small congregations, the jump into technology is seen as too disruptive for what made their community special to them. These smaller churches are often part of a larger community or kinship structure, so it's likely that these people still engage with each other, but without the ritual elements present. Other churches have just omitted this part of their life together, choosing to focus more on teaching and encouragement, since those can happen more naturally on a social media or virtual platform. A bit of a half step are congregations that are attempting to keep things as close as possible to before. I would call this a broadcast model, where they might live stream, and that live stream shows clergy performing the rituals, and the congregation is more of a spectator for the liminality cycle. Again, this is putting off the question of how to transfer these embodied rituals to virtual space. Both of these approaches still treat the ritual as if it is only real when it is physically practiced. So I'm more interested in seeing where adaptation is taking place. An example that we saw of this broadcast model outside of Christian tradition was a Passover Seder that was hosted by Jason Alexander on YouTube. And this featured remote guests leading each part of the ritual meal. It was viewed by over 1.5 million people, and a lot of the comments that came up on that broadcast were about people who had never been to a Passover Seder, people who had never experienced that ritual and were learning about it for the first time. To give you an idea of the issues involved in adapting a ritual, let me tell you a little bit about baptism, because I think this is the one that might stick with us for a while, even after our health crisis is over. Baptism, as a ritual practice in Judaism, dates back to before the 6th century BCE as a means of purification and for conversions. It is present in the Christian scripture, most notably John the Baptizer, who comes prior to Jesus and is teaching the people, and then Jesus himself is baptized. The story of the early church also involves baptism as part of a conversion practice, and it fits a textbook definition of the liminality cycle. This is an ancient ritual that has layers of meaning applied on top of having this theological significance. And getting back to that dual embodiment concept, baptism is this ritual event that initiates someone into the community and, in some cases, confers a new spiritual identity. In evangelical language, it, quote, washes away your sins. So the physical act has this spiritual connotation. And this is one reason why clergy or another leader will generally orchestrate the process. They will lead the initiate through what you do. And the question of whether this can or should be done across distance pokes at this issue of urgency to perform the ritual, because if it's linked to someone's eternal salvation, you don't want to wait until sickness passes. You want to do it as soon as possible. There are also demographic statistics related to how we measure this church initiation, church affiliation. And that's what gets us back to the controversy that was surrounding the Church of Scotland, where traditionalists were arguing that by changing the medium of a ritual, they'd be robbing baptism of its sacred importance and using this gimmick of being online as a way to puff up their numbers. Another question came up in a group of pastors about how to conduct baptism. And in this conversation, specifically, the person was in a tradition that practices immersion. That's where a leader will lower a person into water to be completely submerged before lifting them back up. Some other traditions might just sprinkle or pour water onto the hands or the head of a person. But for this person, practicing immersion had two components to it. How do we baptize someone remotely? In which case, are there ways to instruct someone on how to hold the person, how to place them in the water, how to lift them up? Can family members do this? The other had to do with how to baptize someone while maintaining social distancing. That is, if we are going to gather together but still need to keep 6 feet, 2 meters of separation, how are we supposed to do that? And this conversation came around to the significance of a pastor or leader being the one to hold someone, that they're physically holding them and placing them in the water. How are we supposed to do our ritual this way when we're used to being right next to someone, holding them in our arms, placing them down when we also have this distance? because that's the customary way that we have done this, it seemed impossible to think that someone might dunk themselves and then rise up, that we would hold people in a different way, or that the hold would be such a necessary part of the ritual. The responses to the pastor's question were all over the map, which speaks to the diversity of Christianity, but also to these underlying assumptions about how rituals work, and there being a set way that we remember them happening in the past and wanting to maintain that form. And so how do we navigate adaptation in a way that best reflects the ritual community? And how do we understand the dynamics at work behind the scenes? And this is where adaptation is happening, is a way for us to better understand cultures around us, or cultures that we're becoming a part of or seeking to understand. So to look at the variety of ways that Christian communities have adapted their rituals, I applied a framework that tries to capture the degree to which form and meaning fall along a spectrum from fluid to fixed. I've used this structure in the past for community organizing and past research, and to help illustrate how form and meaning relate to each other, I'm going to describe these adaptations with another ritual, the communion or Eucharist. Now, this ritual traces its origin back to Jesus, where he shared a meal with his disciples before his arrest and execution. During this meal, he blesses a loaf of bread, distributes, and then pours a cup of wine to share. He likens the bread to his body and the wine to his blood, and instructed them to remember him when they ate these things. And the early church takes this ritual and expands it to become a community meal. And as Christianity then spread to the rest of the world, this ritual has maintained a role in signifying one's initiation and regularly re-entering liminal space and experiencing communitas. So we're going to look at form and meaning along a spectrum of fixed and fluid, and the way that a community will see their ritual in those four different categories. So let's look at form first. Some traditions have a highly fixed manner in which they practice, such as the Roman Catholic tradition. They have a specific set of clergy who prepare and provide the elements, which are also specific, and the ritual behavior to bless and distribute is strictly governed. A key to determining a fixed position is whether this format is codified. Are there rules that surround how this is to be performed? On the other end of the spectrum, a fluid form is open to experimentation and differentiation, whether that pertains to the frequency of practice, the materials used, the people who administer it, or the availability for participation. Examples of this type of communion could be traditions that adopt local ingredients or incorporate this ritual into a larger meal. We see this at dinner church or in an event that celebrates communion with tacos and beer, that there is less of a strict governance of the elements themselves. In regards to meaning, a fixed meaning community has similar structures around the significance of a ritual. Now, this is often codified in doctrines or statements of faith about what the ritual elements are supposed to signify and how they function in a metaphysical sense. And a key determinant here is usually the social rules around participation. A fixed form ritual will have definitions about who performs it, but a fixed meaning will have boundaries about who is allowed to perform the ritual and become part of the communitas, and then reintegrate into the wider life of the church. A church with a fluid sense of meaning has a deliberate embrace of plurality of the essence of the ritual. We see themes of open interpretation, the presence of interfaith encounter and appreciation, and the diversity of a community along socio-political, gender economic, racial, and cultural lines is expected. This is also known as open communion, meaning that there is no test of faith or social barrier to participate. And this has opened up some good conversations about differences in form and meaning. This is also where an interesting divide occurs between branches of the Christian tradition. I would characterize a major distinction between traditions as being either fixed form, fluid meaning, or fluid form, fixed meaning. And so how does a fixed form and embodied community adapt to this virtual space? What I have seen primarily is that it's a more passive participation. A congregant may be viewing their priest or other leader conduct the ritual, but they're not engaged themselves. And we do have examples from before the health crisis about how a fixed form tradition adapts to special circumstances. We have instructions for providing spiritual care for people during wartime, sickness, or isolation, for example. So we know that there are types of accommodations that are already made for religious life and rituals to happen outside of physical proximity. But these are always seen as deviations from the norm, and the fixed form, the in-person embodied, is always preferred. And so these fixed form communities, I would say that they are optimistic that the restrictions on movement will be over soon, and so they can return to life as normal as possible. While there be some relief to return to familiar rituals, I think they'll also find themselves disconnected from their larger communities that are rooting themselves in online life. People who are not only comfortable, but who prefer to be in virtual space and find meaningful relationship there. Fluid form traditions, I would say, they're more comfortable with making these adjustments. And we have seen participation with the ritual in this way consist of replacement, like using tea and biscuit in place of the ritual elements, and people participating themselves, but in ways that do not match the original form. When we shift from form over to meaning, the differences between fixed and fluid become much more nuanced. The key determinant here is designating whether a community trends towards fixed or fluid. It has to do with their comfort with plurality. Again, this is where liminality theory is helpful to consider who is invited to enter the ritual. How is liminality and communitas experienced, whether that is prescriptive or an open-ended fashion, and what is a person standing once they reintegrate to the community? Broadly speaking, the churches that are most fluid with ritual and innovative with technology also tend to be the most restrictive in terms of who is allowed to participate in the life of the church community. Because of fixed meaning and prescriptive liminality, ritual initiation can still maintain distinctions by race, gender, or orientation. By contrast, churches that are more open for interpretation and inclusive toward diversity tend to have a stronger attachment to ritual forms and physical presence. And that was something that surprised me a bit, that church traditions generally broke in these opposite directions. So I see a few things coming out of this. On one hand, I think there'll be a reckoning from people who experience liminality and consider themselves part of a community, who will return to that physical community only to be rejected because of their racialized identity, their gender, or sexuality. For the other set of churches, those who may have been reluctant to incorporate technology or to consider alternative forms to rituals, they may have reached a tipping point for adapting those physical forms. And that adaptation is what might allow them to determine how to carry their tradition forward. They have begun online ministries out of necessity. And while some will be happy to forget this episode and go back to the physical forms, others will see the benefit of having a stronger and more dynamic online presence that allows them to connect with people who they wouldn't have otherwise. And so, to get back to the original question for this series about what makes us human, I believe that it's our desire for meaning and to experience that relationship with others. The other part of what makes us human is our adaptability to discover that meaning. So wherever an institution falls on the fixed and fluid continuums, there's an opportunity there to adjust to the contemporary world without losing what is distinctive about one's tradition. And it is communities who are willing to lean into these adaptations and innovations that will see themselves growing and finding new ways to live their religious life, both in a crisis environment and in the continuing virtual era. So this is what I think the crux of the matter is how do we balance continuity with innovation, especially as so many people find a sense of purpose and spirituality through their connection to a religious community, whether it is through translation, migration, technological innovation, or today, health crisis. There are plenty of reasons to be thinking critically about adaptation in an interconnected and ever-changing world.
If you wish to explore the topic of ritual and religion further, we recommend works by Loria, Dries, or to check out the Center for Religious Studies online, an institute for interdisciplinary research in religion with work currently being done in innovation.
If you would like to participate in the series or ask our speakers any questions, you can reach out to us through our website, www.omniology.co.za, or on social media at omniology_za.